Hi everyone, in today's video we are going to continue with our series on ancient history, and we're going to start talking about Egypt. We are going to have a couple of videos in which we are going to discuss about the Egyptian civilization, different dynasties, since as is well known, the Egypt and the history of Egypt is one of the most fascinating ones in the world. When we talk about Egypt, we have to start talking about the Egyptian chronology from the different dynasties, pharaohs, and we have to start with the early dynastic period that started from 3100 till 2700 BC. Later on we have the Old Kingdom that lasted between 2700 till 2200. After that we have the first intermediate period, a time of chaos in the land of Egypt that was between 2200 and 2050. After that we have the Middle Kingdom. That period was between 2050 till 1650. After that we have the second intermediate period. It was a time in which people known as the Hyksos, foreigners that came, invaded the land and conquered Egypt, and they were the rulers of the land, the pharaohs, for during this time being between 1650 and 1540. After that we have the appearance of the New Kingdom with the 18th dynasty till the 20th dynasty between 1540 and 1069 BC. So we have here, this is more or less the chronology that historians have agreed upon regarding the history of Egypt. And when we talk about the Egyptian geography, we have to mention, of course, the many aspects in this case. First of all, important places and valleys such as the Nile River Valley. Of course, we all know the importance of the Nile River for the Egyptian life, Egyptian economy till this very day. The Delta we have to mention, and we will be talking more about Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. We'll talk about the cataracts, Nubia, the Libyan Desert, the Sinai Peninsula, and there were certain concepts such as what the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, was the black land, the fertile soil, and what they call the Shret, which was the red land or desert, land of tenebrosity or danger, a land beyond the boundaries of Egypt. People were afraid to go into this area. And of course the Egyptian civilization was flourished and developed for thousands of years, and it was located located in a land that was of course very fertile soil. We have that during the floods of the Nile River that happened during spring, July this time, until September, that people tried to they constructed like dikes in order to keep the water for the longest period of time, in order to fertilize the soil and to have, of course, later on the harvest. And the floodings of the Nile River were very predictable, so every year people were ready, and they already knew a specific time and the longest period of floods and rain, so they will be able to produce their food, crops, etc. And we know that they developed what is called a basin irrigation, which was basically this kind of system of dikes, as I mentioned, that was built around the land in order to keep the water in the land as long as possible. And of course all of this silt and mud that came with the flood helped to fertilize the soil, and the land was very productive in this case. Regarding the Egyptian gods, the Egyptians had hundreds of thousands of gods. Each city had hundreds of gods, and like that was with different of the Egyptian cities. Of course, some of the most famous ones were, of course, Osiris. Osiris was the god of the dead. The story tells us that he was killed by his brother and cut into pieces and thrown to the river. Later on, his sister, who was also his wife, Isis, she gathered all the pieces, put it back, and brought him back, resurrected him. And here we have a clear example from antiquity of mention of resurrection, bringing dead back to life. He was depicted with the color green, which is, in this case, historians tell us that represents agricultural rebirth, since he was like born again or brought back to life. In this case, he was the god of the dead, the god of the underworld. We have certain concepts within Egyptian religion, such as and also within society, of course, such as the concept of ma'at. Ma'at is this concept of harmony, the concept of justice, righteousness. And we have, when the pharaohs or the nobles die, history tells us, archaeology tells us that in this case there was something called the Book of the Dead, or they call it the Papyrus of Necht, in which the book contains certain magical formulas, incantations, and also a clear help or aid of the soul after in the afterlife, in order to pass the trial of Osiris, the god of the dead. Because Egyptians believe in the immortality of the soul. It's deep concept and complicated, because they believe that the soul was divided in 9 different parts, and certain parts went to different places and stand before Osiris for trial. But the short story tells us that Necht tells Osiris, and Maat, which is in this case Maat, not only was this concept of harmony and justice, but Maat also was a goddess. And he tells Osiris of all the good deeds that he had done on earth, and basically all what he needs to do in order to get into the afterlife and go into the paradise or the garden or reeds. That's kind of the concept in this case of reward, in which the person would get back all that he had lost on earth, another life in the afterlife, or in other similar way of living or continuing existence. The story or records tells us that they used to weight the heart of the person against a feather, and that's why here we have this concept of mat. Why? Because if the heart weighted less than the feather, then the person was, in this case, awarded with paradise and a good life in the afterlife. It was, of course, all Osiris and the 48 members of the councils debated, and with justice, equality, righteousness, they considered eternal life to this person. But if the heart used to weigh more than the feather, then there was no such thing as hell, like later on in other religions. In Egyptian religion, if the heart is to weigh more than the feather, that means that that heart was taken and thrown to the floor, and then there was a god, I think was called Amanti, or that's one of the names that they call it. Sometimes they call it Matu also. And it was a god with the head of a crocodile, the front of a leopard, and the back of a rhino. And this god is to devour and eat the heart, which represents the total annihilation of the soul, non-existent. Non-existence in this case was worse than hell. And so we can see here some of the Egyptians, the beliefs of the Egyptians. And in the beginning, of course, the only one that could aspire to this kind of afterlife were the rich people, the pharaohs. But later on, this kind of concept was expanded to all Egyptian society in general. We have different and many other gods. We have, of course, this process of mummification, in which, of course, only the rich people, the pharaoh, the nobles, generals were the only ones that used to or could enjoy of these mummifications, since it was important to preserve the body, since they thought that was needed for the life in the afterlife. And we have during this time the early dynastic period between 3100 till 2700, that the first pharaoh was Nermes. Also he was known as Menes. He had different names. That happened, as I mentioned, in 3100 3100 BC, and the records depict him as the first pharaoh and also the first ruler that united Upper and Lower Egypt. We have in this case the ruling of a pharaoh. So what were the responsibilities of a pharaoh? What was his role? And we know that the pharaohs were actually considered the absolute rulers of the land of Egypt. A pharaoh was also a religious leader. He was a divinity. He was considered to be a god, a living god. Therefore, his institution was divine. A pharaoh was, this position was a dynastic position, meaning that a pharaoh has a son, and he passed his kingdom, his kingship to his son, and like that. Male heirs were preferred. That doesn't mean that females couldn't be pharaohs. In fact, there were a few female in history that they became pharaohs, but preferably they choose male successors. So the general idea here is that the pharaoh, as I mentioned, he was the ruler, but also the chief priest of the whole land of Egypt, a living god, as I mentioned before. Now we have the Egyptian society that was divided in different classes. Of course, the first one was the pharaoh, a god, and he was the absolute central authority in the land. He was the religious leader. He was the divinity. He was also a dynastic ruler. We have then the upper class. The upper class, we have here the nobles, court officials, generals. We have the priests. We have the scribes. These are the high people, upper class. Then number 3, we have the artists. We have the craftsmen, these kind of people. We have then the last and lower class. These people were the peasant and the farmers. The farmers, the ones that used to work the land for the pharaoh, because everything belonged to the pharaoh. So these people, the farmers, they even have to work not for themselves but for the pharaoh. So we have that. After the early dynastic period, we have the what is known as the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom that is a time period that was between 2700 till 2200 BC, and we have here a bureaucratic organization. Of course, the pharaoh is always the top head, but we have viziers. Viziers were like chief officials, the second person after the pharaoh. We have the pharaoh, and the second one, the viziers. The viziers were the ones in charge of the construction of the pyramids, and the ones in charge of construction of monuments and these building projects. We have also that the land was divided in a total of 42 provinces, known as in this case, nomes is the word. Nomarchs were the governors, the officials in charge of ruling these 42 states or provinces of the land of Egypt. Of course, everybody under the rule of the pharaoh. We have that the oldest pyramid that was constructed, the first monumental building in the land, and also the oldest monumental building in the world, is actually the pyramid of Djoser. We know that this pyramid was built in Saqqara in the year 2700 BC. And just to finalize this kind of idea, all the burials were on the west side of the Nile River. So in the next video, no, before we end, we have to mention briefly about of course, the famous the pyramids of Giza. These pyramids were constructed during the time of the 4th dynasty, during the Old Kingdom period. The well-known, of course, we have the pyramid of Khufu. He was the Great Pyramid was his tomb. That was built around 2500 BC. We have the pyramid of Khafre and the one of Menkaure. And of course the nobles, they have certain tombs known as mastaba, and it's thought or believed that from the mastabas they later on developed the idea of creating these big monuments. And as I mentioned before, the pharaoh, he was known to be a god, divine, immortal, and the pyramids, or specific pyramid, was his tomb, and the pyramid was supposed to last forever. Like the pharaoh was immortal, therefore his resting place was supposed to be also or last forever, and also as a symbol of the power of the pharaoh. So this is it for this video. In the next one we are going to start talking about the Middle Kingdom and the 12th dynasty, and the first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, and all the amazing Egyptian history. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.